What is the most difficult role to play in the World of Warcraft? This is a hotly debated subject that is so very difficult to get an objective viewpoint on. Of course, I have my own bias, but I'm going to do my absolute best to break this down and remain as objective as possible. The roles I will be ranking are tanks, healers, ranged DPS, and melee DPS. And just so you know where my bias and perspective come from, I actively raid with 3 toons. I am also a heroic raider. My main is a Death Knight tank, my main alt is a Resto Druid, and my less played alt is a Hunter. So aside from a melee DPS, I have some decent insight on all the roles and how to play them. So I'm going to utilize a couple different raid compositions as my list does change depending on the skill levels involved. The first group will be a random group of players, let's say a 20-person raid, with players ranging from the top 20% to the bottom 70% of the player base in terms of skill. Just want to keep it average. The second composition will consist of a 20-person guild raid where players range between the top 10 to 20% of the player base skill level. Now, let's get the constant variables out of the way. Let's imagine a boss that splits out damage and mechanics to all roles evenly. Tanks, healers, DPS, all have an equal share of responsibility and nobody is dealing with more or less than the others. Let's also assume that this is a group of players that are familiar with the raid and the mechanics, meaning nobody here is new. They've cleared it a few times and know what's expected. So let's talk about the first random group and my pick for the easiest role to play, ranged DPS. Now, the biggest reason for this being the easiest role is primarily due to visibility. Ranged DPS have the best unobstructed view of the battlefield and the mechanics. Now, the biggest downside to the ranged DPS is that their DPS can suffer during mechanics and abilities that require high movement. So what's the next easiest? Tanks. Now, tanks are a little different, and my bias may be showing here because it is what I do. But I will say that tanks take the longest to get comfortable. As a DPS or a healer, you have specific mechanics and abilities to be aware of. As a tank, you not only have specific mechanics and abilities, but you have to know the other mechanics and abilities because you are in charge of the positioning. So while I think tanks are one of the hardest roles starting out, once they truly know the fight, you're just kind of chilling. But what makes the role harder than the ranged DPS? Positioning. You have to account for all the other players, be aware of their positioning, and be aware of what mechanics they are doing. If the DPS is messing up a mechanic that's next to the boss, it could severely damage or kill the other DPS, so you're constantly fighting the positioning battle the entire encounter. Obviously, the other biggest downside to this is visibility. Because of all the spell effects and things that are going on, it does become difficult to maintain positioning while you're trying to juggle all the on-screen effects. All right, the last two. Melee DPS. The absolute biggest reason for this role is visibility. And yes, tanks are also melee. However, tanks have tons of survivability. They're supposed to take damage. Melee DPS lack that survivability, so they are punished for missing a mechanic or ability. And when you're fighting a red boss in a red arena with red attacks, it's just a nightmare. Another reason is having to lessen DPS or have periods of no DPS due to disengaging from a boss, whether it be from mechanics or positioning. So that means the hardest role to fill in a random group is healers. The main reason for this is simple. Not only do they have their own mechanics to be aware of, but they have 19 other mechanics to watch if you're in a random group and you don't know these people. You don't know how they play. You can't expect them to be successful with performing every mechanic and avoiding every ability. So you never really know what to expect from them. This causes a heightened sense of anxiety and stress, which adds to the overall difficulty of the raid. All right, so just a quick recap for a 20-person pug, easiest to hardest. Ranged DPS, tanks, melee DPS, and finally healers. Now, let's talk about a 20-person guild raid with highly skilled players. The easiest, tanks. The same still applies for hardest in terms of learning, but once comfortable, this is the easiest role. You're playing with higher skilled players that you're familiar with, so you aren't having to stress out over positioning. Next is healers. Running with the same group, you're going to know which member is more prone to standing in the fire just a little longer than they should, or which member will pop a CD and eat an attack to keep their DPS up. While you're still technically dealing with 19 other mechanics, you have less stress as you have knowledge here and it's not just randomness. The last two, and I'm sure some people are going to disagree here, but ranged DPS is harder than healing and melee DPS is the hardest role. And allow me to explain what separates them first. Ranged DPS have the advantage of ultimate visibility, so it gives them a slight edge over the melee when it comes to difficulty. Now allow me to explain why DPS is the hardest role. When everyone is performing at a top level, tanks and healers will plateau. Sure, you can have a tank do slightly better DPS than the other tank, but as a whole, as long as the tanks are alive, keeping aggro, and in position, nobody is going to say anything. The same applies to healers. As long as people aren't dying, nobody's going to say anything. Now, when it comes to DPS, they are always being compared to the other DPS on the DPS meter. It doesn't matter if someone perfectly avoids every mechanic or ability. If they aren't at the top of the DPS meter, then they aren't the best DPS. Even if you want to argue that one class is always better than another class according to the DPS rankings, if someone is playing the quote top class and is getting beat, it is brought into question. Why is that rogue below the warrior? They're supposed to be meta. DPS have the hardest role because no matter how perfect they play, the DPS meter is always the judge of their skill. Alright, so just a quick recap for a 20-person guild raid, easiest to hardest. Tanks, healers, ranged DPS, and melee DPS. So that's my take on which is the hardest role to play. Here's what you guys and gals voted for. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Special thanks to these channel members. If you enjoyed this video, then please press the like button and subscribe if you enjoy WoW content. If you want to learn how to tank, heal, or do better as a DPS, then check out my channel for tips and tricks on those roles. Channel memberships are also available for 99 cents. They give you early ad-free access to all new videos, behind the scenes content, and more. I also live stream here on YouTube and Twitch. I'll see you in the next one.